Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening of the National Constitution Center's fall season. It is so exciting to be back and to welcome you to this wonderful institution, which, as one or two of you may know, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And we are so excited to open this great season with this wonderful program in partnership with the Penn program on democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism, featuring my old friend and the nation's greatest scholar of polarization and the Constitution in general, Cass Sunstein. We are so fortunate to have him back at the NCC. My great colleague Roger Smith will introduce him in a moment, but I just want to tell you how extraordinary the season that we have coming up is, and to encourage you to take this town hall flyer and leaf through it and come back early and often. Look at this amazing lineup. Next week, Constitution Day, with Justice Breyer in attendance, we're launching our new interactive Constitution, where the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society, the leading liberal and conservative lawyers groups in America, have come together to nominate scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution, what they agree about and what they disagree about. And the College Board, whose president will be here as well, has decided to make this the centerpiece of the new AP History and Government exams. It is an amazing achievement, and we want to share it with you and the 2,000 school kids who will be here next week. And then on September 21st, to commemorate the Pope's visit, we have a symposium on American faith with the greatest scholars of religious liberty in America from all perspectives, debating the contemporary and historic meaning of the First Amendment. Commissioner Charles Ramsey is starting up a new program with school kids so they can talk to new police recruits, and those police recruits can learn about the Constitution. Already 1,000 new recruits have come through this place, and we are expecting much more. And then authors from Anne Marie Slaughter to John Meacham, a great program on school choice, federal judges from around the country on the legacy of Reconstruction, culminating on Bill of Rights Day on December 15th. And if that's not enough, our traveling town halls around the country, from Chicago to Grand Rapids, Michigan, with debates on the Second Amendment and affirmative action. It is just going to be an amazing time here at the NCC. And I should say, the NCC, although despite our inspiring congressional charter, is a private nonprofit. We depend on the support of loyal and wonderful members like you. Those who are not members, go to the website, join for any level, and then you can be sure to get these flyers and learn about all our programs as they occur and come for free. It is now my tremendous pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Roger Smith, who is the director of the Penn program on democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism, also one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars and historians. He is the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Penn. He writes about American political thought, modern legal and political theory, and citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. He is the author of Civic Ideals, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and has won many awards from the American Political Science Association and other distinguished institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Roger Smith.
Thank you, Jeff. You know, I have been thrilled to have Jeff Rosen as president of the National Constitution Center, because it's so great to have a superb constitutional scholar, a leading legal journalist, also being the CEO of this organization. I hadn't quite realized what great pitchman skills he has as well. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm actually here in two capacities. I am chair of the Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism program. I'm also Associate Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, and I say that because Dean Stephen Fluharty is the principal investigator on the grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that supports most of our work, supplemented by a generous grant from the Mary and David Boys Family Fund. And we are greatly appreciative of their support. We're also very appreciative to continue our partnership with the National Constitution Center. Of course, it was not very far from here that the Americans in Philadelphia in 1787 created the first modern constitutional democracy, thereby completing the transformation of themselves from English subjects to American citizens. And those themes of democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism we pursue in all our work. It was one of the purposes of the American Constitution to promote the progress of science and the useful arts, and it is a feature of the society they created that it has pursued technological innovation in ways that have transformed the conditions for democracy over time, and never more so than in our own time. And that is the subject of the DCC program theme for the year, Digital Media and the Futures of Democracy. We'll have a superb program that will be held henceforth on the Penn campus, and I am very grateful to our planning committee, chaired by Michael Della-Carpini, the Dean of the Annenberg School of Communications, and also including his colleague Sandra Gonzalez-Bailon, David Grazian of the Penn Sociology Department, Jeff Green of Political Science, and Christopher Yu of the Law School for putting together what I think will be a terrific program, and it could not begin better than with our speaker tonight, who simply is one of the most impressive and important intellectual and political thinkers in America today. He is the Robert Walmsley University Professor and Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University, and his scholarship has included major contributions to constitutional law, to administrative law, to environmental law, to law and economics, to legal and political philosophy. He is incredibly prolific, having written some 35 books. He is the most widely cited legal scholar alive today. But what I think is also tremendously impressive is that he chose to take time out from academia and do public service as the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration, building on the insights of one of his many influential books, Nudge, suggesting new approaches to regulation. But in addition to all that work, building on his early philosophical and empirical work on preference formations, and he has been writing for years on the way that new digital media, the way that the internet and other new media are influencing the shaping of political opinions. Well known for his book, Republic.com. He continues that discussion today with his presentation on Polarization 2.0, Democracy and Extremism in the Age of Digital Media. Please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Well, thank you so much, Rogers. So you've had two speakers so far. They didn't go on for very long, but I want to say something about Jeff and Rogers that occurred to me just speaking to them for a brief time just a few minutes ago. They're great people and great leaders, but they also have an office which ranks with that of citizen. Maybe it's a modifier as the highest office in the land, and that's they are great patriots. And to be invited to them for this occasion, really I'm greatly honored and humbled, and let's see how it goes, shall we? In terms of polarization, as Rogers referred to my time in government, something flashed before my eyes which wasn't like a death threat or anything like that. It was my interactions with senators who thought that in choosing me to head the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, President Obama had made a very, very bad mistake. And there were, I think I got, who's counting, upwards of 30 negative votes. One of my most concerned critics was Senator Saxby Chambliss, who was very worried about some of my writings. And Senator Chambliss became, in part because he expressed that concern, and I met with him, he became one of my very favorite senators. Senator Chambliss, a great senator, a great human being, who was concerned only with one thing, that is the well-being of the American people as he understands it. And during some of the processes of not very long ago, when the filibuster was constrained by the Democrats in the Senate, one of the things Senator Chambliss said to me, I was very touched by, he said, look, because we had the filibuster, you and I got to know each other. So that made a big difference for both of us. And I'm not taking a stand at all on filibuster reform, but I want to say that Senator Chambliss was on to something very important, which is that the fact that he was so concerned for reasons that were honorable with this particular appointment by the president, got a dialogue going across lines that actually had, I think, a very beneficial impact on the American people. Okay, that's a little story. You see the title, Democracy, Extremism, and Social Media. That is the title. And I wish I had one or two claims for you. I actually have 5. So let's see if we can keep them in mind. The first is that extremism is not a product of mental illness or character or poverty. It's largely a product of social influences and social networks. So James Carville famously said, with respect to elections, it's the economy, stupid. It's the social influences. We don't have an adjective after that. It's the social influences, exclamation point. Of course, poverty, mental illness, and character can play a role, but the spotlight should be placed on social influences and networks. The second claim is using a term from a terrific political scientist, Russell Hardin, who teaches in NYU. A crippled epistemology is a good description of the situation of unjustified extremists, where crippled epistemology means very simply, it's what they know that matters, and what they know isn't so much. The third point is that our beliefs are often a product of the exchange of information. So the fact that there was a human being named George Washington, Jeff may have firsthand knowledge of that. I personally don't. I accept it on the basis of informational influences that I trust. And social media can provide informational influences. If you think a bit about what your beliefs are, the full universe of your beliefs, a startling percentage of them depend not on personal or firsthand information, but instead on what we believe from those who we trust. Claim number 4 is, apart from information, reputational influences matter. That is, we want people we care about to think that we are competent and likable, mostly, unless we're really disagreeable types. And that means that what we say and do will often be an artifact, at least in part, of our desire to seem competent and likable. That's just a fact of the human species. That's okay. It can, on the social media, turn out to be very important. With respect to the problem of unjustified extremism, free speech can be and often is a cure. Justice Brandeis famously said that more speech rather than enforced silence is the proper remedy for falsehoods. That's basically right. Free speech can be a cure, but it can also be a problem. And I'm going to emphasize the latter because I think it's more interesting and to that extent more important than the kind of dominant cliche, which is good, which is that free speech can be a cure. Okay, now law professors typically write short texts and long footnotes. You've heard the text? Here come the footnotes. Okay, this is going to be an empirical talk, meaning I'm going to talk about facts, not a normative talk, meaning I'm not going to talk a lot about shoulds. I'm going to try to capture some of the effects of a system of free expression. One answer to that question is that it can help breed extremism. The question of what to do, given the empirical findings, is really hard, and I'm going to touch on them only tentatively. I do have extremist violence as the most poignant and difficult challenge, and I'm going to refer to that explicitly. and suggesting that some of the sources of genuine threats to the American people lie in a system of free expression. So I want to talk a little bit about that disturbing fact. Okay, here's some background for you. There's a social psychologist who taught for many years in Pennsylvania named Solomon Asch, who did some experiments about the length of lines. And we're going to do this experiment together with your indulgence. Okay, here's 2 lines on the left. Can you match those 2 lines with the lines on the right that they are closest to? If you can't, maybe go to an eye doctor tomorrow. This isn't really hard. As Asch designed the experiment, there was a person, let's call that person you, in a room with a few other people, let's say it's 6, let's call them them. And in various rounds of the experiment, the them, the other people in the room with you, make what is unambiguously a mismatch. So you're in the room with 6 strangers, and they all make a mistake. What do you do? Okay, you're kind of going to look like a more handsome or pretty version of this guy. This guy, no offense to this guy, but he looks at this occasion, you know, like he's struggling a lot. He's puzzled. The reason he's puzzled is the other people in the room are making a mismatch. What does he do? Okay, what he does is think, look, the other people in the room with me think that a line that clearly does not match the line to which they're pointing actually does match that line. He's puzzled because he's thinking, I'm getting a lot of information from what other people are saying, and that information is contradicting my perception of reality. What do I do? He's also thinking, if I make the correct match by my lights, I'm going to look like an idiot in front of other members of the human race, and I don't want to do that. So imagine yourself, if you would, in this very room in which other people are making what is palpably the wrong call. What are you going to do? The fact is that across a series of rounds, most members of the human race in most nations will at least once defy the evidence of their own senses and make a mismatch to conform to the unanimous majority. Now, we don't know to what extent these errors are a product of people thinking, I must have been wrong. My eyes must have deceived me. And to what extent they were thinking, I was right, but I don't want to look foolish in front of the others. Probably the best account is that both explanations are mattering. Okay, the powerful insight here is that even with respect to something very simple, what line matches what other line in size, human beings will go along with a group and defy their own knowledge. Okay, now I'm going to jump to a much more recent experiment that I was involved in that involved 2 cities in Colorado. The first is Boulder, and the second is Colorado Springs. If you know anything about Colorado, you probably know that Boulder is left of center. They're most unlikely to go Republican in 2016, and if they do, the Democrats are in terrible, terrible trouble in 2016. And Colorado Springs, we also did the experiment in, and that's right of center. They like Republicans. Okay, what we did was to get groups of people in Colorado Springs groups, and in the same time period, get people in Boulder groups. We asked group members first to record their views on climate change and same-sex unions anonymously and privately. Then we asked them to get into groups, just the Boulder people in Boulder groups, just the Colorado Springs people in Colorado Springs groups, no mixing, to deliberate to a verdict on climate change, whether the U.S. should enter into an international treaty, same-sex unions, whether they should be allowed. And then after they came to their verdicts, we asked them to come up anonymously with post-deliberation views on all 3 topics. What do you think would happen? Would you expect something different to happen in Boulder than in Colorado Springs? Would you expect people to stay where they were? Would you expect them to move to the middle? One of my hunches was that if you get a group of people in Boulder, they're going to end up right in the middle of Boulder. And if you get people in Colorado Springs, after they talk to each other, they're all going to go to the middle of Colorado Springs. That's not what happened. They got more unified and more extreme. Once people in Boulder, there is no Boulder Springs so far as I'm aware. No offense to any of you if you're actually from Boulder Springs. The people in Boulder got very unified and very extreme on climate change and same-sex unions. The people in Colorado Springs got very unified and very extreme. Whereas there were people in Boulder who were not so sure about climate change, after they talked to one another, they were sure about climate change. There were people in Colorado Springs who thought maybe same-sex unions are fine. After they talked to one another, they thought same-sex unions really are not fine. As a result, we got, just as a matter, and think if you would about the kind of extraordinary nature of this finding, just after a short period of deliberation, about half an hour, the people in Colorado Springs and the people in Boulder were occupying different political worlds. Before they talked with one another, they really weren't. The people in Colorado Springs were to the right of the people in Boulder, but there was much more overlap. Does this happen on the internet today? Yes, every day. The equivalent of our Boulder and Colorado Springs experiment is occurring every day as like-minded people end up more extreme because they're communicating mostly with people with whom they already agree. Okay, what about risk-taking? Here's a very old experiment. It was done in Boston. Groups of people were gotten together to answer questions about under what circumstances would you take a risk? Would you start a company? Would you gamble if you had a health issue? Take a plane to Europe or something. What happened was, as a result of discussions with one another, the Americans all became more risk-inclined. That is, after discussions with one another, the Americans were more risk-inclined than they were before they talked. So at least among Bostonians, and there's no reason to think this wouldn't generalize, there was evidence of a systematic risky shift. Now, if this seems a little abstract, think maybe of a group of teenagers deciding whether to do something a little bit dangerous. It wouldn't be amazing, would it, if the group of teenagers ends up, after the exercise of free speech, being more inclined to take risks than they were as individuals before they spoke. So because this finding kind of mapped onto an expectation, people talked in social science of a supposedly universal phenomenon called the risky shift. That's what deliberation did. But then there was a confound. Exactly the same thing was done among citizens of Taiwan, and it went the other way. Systematically, the people of Taiwan were more cautious as a result of group interaction than they were before they started to talk. That's a puzzle, isn't it? It suggests that the risky shift may be just an American phenomenon, which might suggest there are people in America maybe who would be more cautious after they talk to one another, more like the Taiwanese participants. Does it suggest there's something in the Taiwanese culture that suggests not greater extremism, but greater caution as a result of group interactions? Do we need a cultural explanation? Does that suggest that people in one of the American states maybe will show something like what the Taiwanese do? It turns out that these plausible explanations are false. It has nothing to do with culture. The difference between the people in Taiwan and the people in the United States, if you look at the numbers, they're just staring at you, is very simple. Among the Americans, the average person, before they started to talk, was risk-inclined. Then they got more risk-inclined as they talked with one another. Among the Taiwanese, the average person was risk-averse. As they talked to one another, they got more risk-averse, which is to suggest that the group's movement is going to be predicted by where they tend to be before they started to talk. If you got a group of Americans, let's say, who are kind of nervous at the age of 22 about getting married, and ask them whether they should get married under circumstances X, Y, and Z, that group is going to end up more nervous about getting married after they talk to one another. And the reason is that the pre-deliberation tendency is toward nervousness about getting married. To say, put culture to one side, the prediction is that groups will become more extreme in line with their pre-deliberation tendency, and that explains what happened in Taiwan, that explains what happened in the United States, and that explains what happened in Boulder, and that explains what happened in Colorado Springs. You with me? That's the data in all of these experiments. Okay, what explains group polarization? Why does it occur? Okay, there seem to be three things that matter. If you get a group of people and you can think of them as, cautious Democrats who maybe tend to think the minimum wage should be increased, or cautious Republicans who tend to think the minimum wage ought not to be increased, if they talk with one another, they will be corroborated. Once you're corroborated, you get more confident, and once you're more confident, you get more extreme. It's very simple. If on some political issue, is the United States to be trusted by the people of France with respect to foreign aid? People in France might be, I'm not sure, maybe not. But once they talk to other French people who think the United States really probably shouldn't be trusted, they will find their initial inclinations corroborated, and that will breed greater extremism. That's the first explanation. The second is a little more subtle, and I think the coolest of the three. Coolest is the technical social science term. Okay, imagine you have a group of people who think that climate change is something to worry over. Imagine that they're exchanging views within the group. Just as a matter of numbers, the arguments that support the view that climate change is something to worry over will be more numerous than the number of arguments the other way, because that's the group's initial inclination. So people will hear more of those arguments than they will the other way. I actually saw the tapes of some of the Boulder and Colorado Springs discussions, and it's precisely what you could see. In Colorado Springs, there were people who thought climate change was something to worry about, but they were more rare than the people who thought it really wasn't. And then once people are hearing one another, the argument in favor of not worrying about climate change seemed to carry the day. Then they say, oh, it's not something to worry about. The earth is sometimes hot and sometimes cold. This isn't something that we should be expending a lot of resources to prevent. Third explanation has to do with reputation. If you're in a group of people, online or not, in which you have some sort of affiliation, to seem like an outlier in the group isn't a lot of fun. You don't want to seem like you are someone who thinks that the group's tendency is bad. If you like very much, let's say, the Republican frontrunner, whoever it is, and you're in a group of people, one of whom doesn't very much, maybe thinks the Democrat's okay, that person might self-silence to preserve their reputation. Okay, now jumping to law. Think about jury behavior in the context, if you would, of punitive damages. Punitive damages are awarded in the case of egregious wrongdoing. There's some constitutional constraints on what juries can do, but let's just take the existence of punitive damages to be fine and accepted. Suppose you have a company, I'll give one that I actually tested that most people don't think is horrible corporate misconduct, though I do. A company markets a baldness cure, it turns out not to work. I think huge punitive damages, most people think that's not much. Suppose a company makes an exercise machine that people end up falling off of and hurting themselves very badly. People think that's not good. They want to punish that company. An exercise machine that gets you hurt, that company shouldn't be marketing that, so we need to send a strong signal. Okay, I was involved in an empirical project with many, many juries, large numbers of juries, hundreds and hundreds of juries. And here's the systematic tendency. If the jury tends to think that the person should be punished severely, the median person on the jury comes in more severe than the median individual before they started to talk. We measured this on a scale of 0 to 8. If the median juror is at 5, the jury comes in at 6. If the average person on the jury thinks that the case is a 2, the jury comes in at 1. What's going on? It's group polarization yet again. Juries end up systematically more lenient if the median juror is lenient, systematically more severe if the median juror is severe. Now, this is a little technical stuff, punitive damages, but I'd love it if you think for a moment about the importance for politics and self-government and debate of the emotion of outrage, the emotion of outrage. Now, soft versions of outrage can be productive, and in the context of genuinely outrageous situations, strong outrage can also be justified. But I want to draw attention to the mechanism by which the interactions of people who are outraged tend up amplifying where they started. And it can become literally dangerous. This is a little study of jury behavior, not about violence, but outrage could be like a flame, which once it interacts with other flames creates a conflagration. Okay. What about judges? Judges are learned in the law. I was involved in a study that turned out to be lucky because it's very hard to study judicial behavior. You can't experiment with federal judges. If I asked 200 federal judges to assemble for purposes of my experiment, I think they'd say we kind of have a day job. But serendipitously, there's a natural experiment which goes on every week in the United States, which is studyable because federal appellate courts consist of 3-judge panels. Under the Supreme Court, 3-judge panels, and their potential compositions are very simple. It can be 3 Republican appointees, 3 Democratic appointees, 2 Democratic appointees and 1 Republican, 2 Republican appointees and 1 Democrat, and that's it. Can't have any other composition. Now, what that makes discoverable is how will a Republican appointee vote depending on whether he or she is sitting with Republican or Democratic appointees. If you get a Democratic appointee, let's say an Obama appointee, is that person's voting behavior in race discrimination cases going to be different depending on whether they're sitting with Republican and Democratic appointees? This is a way of studying extremism. The prediction might be judges are learned in the law, they are going to vote their judgment of the law, and who they're sitting with will be unimportant. So you could imagine a prediction, which is that sure, Republican appointees will be somewhat different from Democratic appointees, but the composition of the panel will have no impact. That's a reasonable hypothesis. It's not at all correct. In fact, in many areas of the law, if you want to know how a judge is going to vote, these are controversial areas, not garden variety areas. These are environmental protection, civil rights, free speech, that kind of thing. If you want to know how a judge is going to vote in a hard case, the political party of the appointing president is a pretty good predictor. Not fantastic, the law matters, but it's pretty good. If you want to know how a judge will vote, it's often a better predictor to know the political party of the president who appointed the 2 other judges on the panel. Don't ask whether Obama or Bush appointed Judge A if you want to know how Judge A is going to vote. Ask if you want to know how Judge A is going to vote, did Bush or Obama appoint Judges B and C? That's startling, isn't it? That a judge's behavior is well predicted by the political party of the president who appointed the 2 other judges with whom that judge is sitting. Okay, what that means is that if you get a panel that consists of 3 Democratic appointees, guess how they're going to rule? Pretty liberal. If you get a panel of 3 Republican appointees, guess how they're going to rule? That suggests that through the magic of random assignment of judges, we are replicating on the federal courts our Colorado experiment. Not as extreme. Judges follow the law. But there's a tendency. RRR panels look a lot different from DDD panels. It's group polarization in action. Okay, if we are talking about terrorists, people who believe false conspiracy theories, the right diagnosis, I hope I'm vindicating my first claim, has everything to do with social networks and social influences, not with poverty and education. If you look at people who are extreme or potentially violent, it's possible that they grew up poor and without a lot of education, but systematically they're not likely to be poorer and less well educated than similarly situated people who never went that route. It's the social network that produced the problem. I'm going to get to the media before terribly long, but let me lay a little background before we get there. Okay, you might think at this point that balanced presentations would help. So the group polarization phenomenon occurs because like-minded people are exchanging positions with like-minded people. You might think if you give a balanced presentation on gay rights or capital punishment, it might be that people will converge. So if you got the Colorado Springs and Boulder people in the same room and gave them balanced presentations on the issue, wouldn't matter where they're from, Boulder or Colorado Springs, they come kind of in line, or at least where they ended up would be less well predicted by where they started. That's often true, but here's the challenge. There is evidence that if you get a group of people who think that capital punishment is a great idea, and a group of people who think that capital punishment is a terrible idea, and they read balanced presentations, then the people who thought it was a great idea love it even more than they did before, and the people who thought it was a terrible idea think it's even more terrible than they did before. That is to say, under certain circumstances, and I'll try to specify them, exposure to balanced presentations actually increases polarization. What seems to be happening here is two things, and I hope they'll be familiar, given what we've said so far, is that people assimilate information in a biased way. That is, if you read something that says capital punishment is good, it deters crime, the people who are subject to it are true wrongdoers of the most egregious sort, and if you read something saying the capital punishment doesn't deter, it's cruel and inhumane, if you start out thinking it's cruel and inhumane, then the first set of claims will just seem like background noise, and the claims that support what you think will seem extremely convincing and show you that what you thought was right. That's biased assimilation. The other phenomenon is called motivated reasoning, and I think this is extremely important, and we observe it all the time. Well, I have a little boy who is 6 years old. He started first grade today. He's a very good baseball player. We sometimes have games. I hit, he hits. I'm a little stronger than he is. He's only 6, so I kind of have the upper hand. But if there's a hard call, like was he safe at first base, if he's trying to win, he's going to call it he was safe at first base. Not because he's a cheater. He's a good boy. But because he has motivated reasoning, as we all do. It's part of the human species. If you have a team, whether it's a sports team or a political conviction, or a preferred candidate, or a preferred understanding of the Constitution, arguments that fit with your beliefs will seem convincing. Arguments the other way, you're motivated to dismiss them. That's not about processing information, it's about emotions. And these both help account for the fact that balanced presentations sometimes don't help. Okay, if that's obscure, here's a more recent set of findings, just within the last few years, which suggests that sometimes among people, whatever their political views, corrections can backfire. If you all are convinced of some political fact and you read something suggesting you're quite wrong, there's a good chance you're going to believe it even more intensely than you did before you read the correction. People who believed a few years ago that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and then read an apparently credible correction, as people who believe that Obamacare has death panels in it and read an apparently credible correction, they believed it more strongly after they read the correction. And this happens among people left and right, both. There seem to be two explanations, and they're parallel here. One is really motivated. to think that statement is wrong. It's getting your back up. It's hitting at the heart of something you fundamentally believe. That can make your fundamental belief stronger. And you might think to yourself, why would they deny it if it weren't true? The very fact of denial has some informational content. Okay, so there's a connection here evidently with extremism. Group polarization is straightforward. It's all about extremism. Balanced presentations, a little less straightforward, but the simple mechanism is balanced presentations can heighten polarization. Okay, here's something really not good, which is the Islamic State, ISIL, using social media in order to increase its appeal and range. That's not good. And here's something on Facebook, Islamic State, doing the same thing, saying connect with Islamic State, sign up for Facebook today. That's real, I didn't make that up. So this is stuff which is horrific, yes? And it's an exercise of freedom of speech. Okay, here are the big questions. I think they're very fundamental questions, which probably deserve fresh consideration. In 2015, our free speech principle, hard won, is the clear and present danger test, which means that it has to be, in order to be regulable, directed to incite and likely to incite imminent lawless action. There's a good argument that uses of social media, even if they're connected with violent organizations, can't meet that test. Directed to incite and likely to incite imminent lawless action. That's a very tough test. In the 1950s, the Supreme Court, in a famous or infamous case involving communism, had something more like an expected value test, which means not imminent and likely, but instead, how horrible is it? And if it's not that horrible, if it's really, really horrible, maybe it doesn't have to be that imminent and that likely. So as the intensity of the awfulness increases, the stringency of likelihood and imminence requirements diminishes. Now that latter test, that is not the clear and present danger test, basically a cost-benefit test, is the sort of test that the federal government generally uses for regulation. The fear, which accounts for 2015 law, is that if we use a cost-benefit test for speech, we would have fallible institutions engaging in unjustified and probably motivated censorship. Hence the Brandeis claim, more speech, not enforced silence, is the remedy. The Brandeis claim, I think, in view of what I've said, has a less strong empirical foundation. The idea that more speech is the remedy, that's not always correct. It's not always going to work. But it might be still the right guidance in a free society. That's a legitimate question. Okay, within a system of free speech, there are two kinds of actors who seem helpful in cracking the kind of lockbox that group polarization creates. One is surprising validators, and the other is convert communicators. If you want to convince young people not to use illegal drugs, to have someone wearing something like this and approximately my age saying don't use illegal drugs, that might not be super effective. But if you have someone who was relatively recently a drug abuser saying you better not do this, that's a convert communicator. That can be helpful. If you have a surprising validator, meaning someone who you wouldn't think, given their history and background, would be pushing this position, that can have an impact. All this suggests the immense importance of attending to the source of the communication and not just its content in moving people engaged in a system of free expression. Often people make a quick intuitive judgment, of course he would say that or she would say that, which are words of dismissal. The beauty of the surprising validator or the convert communicator in the face of unjustified extremism is they can make that, of course he or she would say that reaction dissolve, because there's no of course. Okay. You can think of a system of free expression as having two possible forms. I think this is the largest point about the architecture of system of free expression that there is. You can think of a system of free expression as having an architecture of serendipity or an architecture of control. If you read a good daily newspaper, you're going to find a lot of stuff in terms of subject matter and points of view that you never would have chosen. If you go on the internet, maybe you have a large capacity to control what it is you're seeing. The system of control is a real challenge because it makes group polarization more likely. Okay, data. Here's some for you. A very recent study finds 3 phenomena on Twitter. The first phenomenon is that on non-political issues like the Super Bowl and marathon bombing, we don't observe any kind of polarization. People aren't congregating into communications universes of like-minded types. That, I think, is good news. And there's a nice question, what falls in the category of non-political and why? On political issues such as marriage equality and presidential campaign, there's a lot of polarization out there. People are using Twitter to congregate into groups of like-minded types. And there's a third type of issue, let's call them politicizable issues, which don't immediately have a political valence, like a school shooting. Everybody hates that. But they become, among certain Twitter users, politicized in the sense that gun control rapidly becomes the topic, and then they look a lot more like marriage equality and presidential campaigns. In 2011, networks were studied on Twitter right before the congressional midterm elections and found a highly segregated partisan structure with extremely limited connectivity between left and right-leaning users. That's a warning sign because it's an architecture for polarization. What about Facebook? Facebook recently published a pretty complicated study for which Facebook thought it was delivering some good news. Its own algorithm, based on many factors, that's a quote, can remove some news from diverse sources that you are less likely to agree with, but not hard news that you're likely to agree with. Okay, so there's an algorithm that is moving in a bit toward polarization. And this shouldn't be amazing because the algorithm's trying to deliver people things they like. The good news that Facebook delivered is that the algorithm filters out just a very small percentage of hard news stories that either conservatives or liberals see. So there is some filtering out, but it's pretty small. What they find, the Facebook authors, is individuals' choices about what to consume and click on is a greater restriction on their exposure to ideas they don't agree with. So both conservatives and liberals are less likely to click on cross-cutting content. Okay, I think the upshot of this is that Facebook, maybe less dramatically than Twitter, but still to some extent, is a place where selectivity and polarization are coming. And the algorithm is increasing both, modestly, but it is. Okay, the biggest study we have of social media and ideological segregation is from 2011. It hasn't been updated to my knowledge. And it has 3 findings which are encouraging from the standpoint of the system of free expression. First, ideological segregation in the aggregate on the internet is pretty low. Most Americans are not using the internet just to read stuff they agree with. It's higher than the segregation of most offline news consumption. So offline, there's less segregation. But it's lower, there's more segregation in terms of face-to-face interactions. And it's not growing over time. Okay, there's reason to think that in terms of the general picture, this is quite promising news. But there are a couple of cautionary notes, hence these eloquent words, but. The cautionary notes are first, We don't know from this study whether people who are seeing stuff they don't agree with are learning from it or instead dismissing it. And it is the case that there are pockets of people on the most prominent social media, Twitter in particular, who are falling prey to ideological self-segregation. Okay, conclusion. We know a lot about the sources of extremism. These two different phenomena, group polarization and bias assimilation, are very important. Not only on the federal courts, but also in life, offline and online, there's a lot to be said for RRD and DDR as compared to RRR and DDD. On the federal courts, those panels that have Bush, Bush, Obama, and Obama, Obama, Bush, have a built-in safeguard that the Bush, Bush, Bush panels and the Clinton, Clinton, Obama panels lack. In some ways, social media is making things worse. To get more empirical about our system of free expression would be an excellent idea, because it shows us the assumptions on which choices have to be made, even if we lack full information. And I'm thinking here of the challenge to the generally superb and hard-won clear and present danger test offered by terrorist groups that are organizing in a sometimes successful way, even though the clarity and presentness of the danger isn't that easy to demonstrate. Okay, this is one view of some parts of our world, 2015. It's not so great. I am right and you lie. And then the other creature, the donkey, says, no, I'm right and you lie. That's not very productive. We have another conception of the world from the great political theorist John Stuart Mill, who in my view on this count was very close to one of the greatest of the founders, James Madison. And this is a quote: "It is hardly possible to overrate the value in the present low state of human improvement of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Such communication has always been and is peculiarly in the present age one of the primary sources of progress." And in the next sentence, I'd like it, if you would, to think of the word nation as one that could be individual, county, community, even fans of a particular baseball team. There is no blank, nation, individual, etc., which does not need to borrow from others, not merely particular acts or practices, but essential points of character in which its own type is inferior. Thanks.
Cass, that was absolutely superb, and I'm so eager for our conversation because we have so much to talk about. So this is the one place in the country dedicated to bring people of different perspectives to do precisely what you are recommending, which is to hear unfamiliar points of views and to allow citizens to make up their own minds. And I want to know how realistic this mission is. So I mentioned in my introduction that we're starting up this great new tool, the Interactive Constitution, that'll go live next week, which is having the leading liberals and conservatives in America writing about every clause of the Constitution, what they agree about and what they disagree about, in order to end polarization. Will it work?
Well, we want to talk about data rather than guesses, so I'll give something that has data behind it. If people who disagree with one another have a shared task, there's real promise. So if there's something they do together, rather than a debate they're having against each other, then there's real promise. To the extent that it moves more toward task performance than to up or down, there's hope.
And that's what we found with the scholars, who quite quickly agreed on their common statements, even as they wrote their separate statements. But what about the students? The AP curriculum is going to put this at its centerpiece. Say you've got a group of liberal students. Are they just going to read the liberal explainers and vice versa, or how is it going to work?
Okay, so there are a couple things to be said. This is a great line to pursue. So one is the rule of law. So especially in election season, the spotlight is often placed on things that we disagree about, across partisan and other lines. But for all I said about federal judges, you could read the same data as I described as a kind of inspiring tribute to the rule of law, such that even in the most ideologically contested cases, you see a ton of agreement between Bush and Obama appointees. And it's because the rule of law. So there's that. If there's a liberal position and a conservative position and the rule of law has no decisive power, like you have a genuinely hard question. Affirmative action as the law now stands, hard question. The exact reach of the Second Amendment, that's a hard question. And the question could be designed for that. Even so, if the system is working well, the ideological disagreement will be much dampened so long as people think their task is not to affirm their identity, but really to try to understand what the Constitution stands for. So there's a way of doing it, which I bet you're onto, which just dampens people's sense I'm here because I'm a blank, rather than where blank is, a Democrat from New York City or a Republican from wherever. I'm here to kind of learn about the law. And so that can work. There's some preliminary evidence that some of the polarization observed among American law students is not observed among American judges. And if we can get ourselves more in the mindset of people who, not naive about the neutrality of law, but knowing there is a meaning to law that isn't just about who you voted for, then this should work.
We're also having a great series of debates here and around the country, sponsored by the leading liberal and conservative groups. And before and after the debates, we vote. And we see which side wins on constitutional grounds. And then we ask who changed his or her mind.
That's great.
And it's surprising that often not that many people change their minds. Sometimes they do. But then we ask who had his or her mind opened, and lots of people do. But should we design the questions differently in light of your evidence?
I'd be much more excited about how amazingly it's going if you saw more people changing their minds. Because there's something I think inspiring about a situation where you have someone, let's say, who's a lifelong Democrat who thinks Justice Scalia is really not his or her favorite, and then there's a debate and they say Justice Scalia is completely right on that. Does that seem to you inspiring? I think it is, because it's a true, and you can use your preferred example. You can just have a mirror image ideologically. There's something about the integrity displayed by the person and the integrity revealed by the process. Now, how to do that exactly? Well, one analogy is if you prime if there's experiments, I might not get them exactly right, but they roughly have this form. If you have Asian girls taking a math test, if you prime before the test, you all are girls, then they don't do as well as they otherwise would. If you prime them before saying you all are Asians, then they do really well. And so if you prime people's political identity, that can make them feel entrenched. But if you make them think of, we're a group of people who are studying the law, then you might, or we're trying to figure out some issues, then the possibility of significant movement should increase.
This makes sense because one of the most moving and dramatic moments we had in the debates was when Alan Dershowitz was arguing that the president did have the power to target and kill American citizens abroad, an unexpected political position. And after he gave the most effective closing argument I've heard, a majority of the audience shifted its views and came around to his side, so that may help. Now I have to ask you about Justice Brandeis. So I'm writing a book about Justice Brandeis and why he matters. It's being published on the 100th anniversary of his confirmation in June, and I'm just now writing the conclusion about what would he make of the internet. So you've given me a sense of this, but I have to dig down a little bit. You're suggesting that his beautiful, well, it was Holmes's clear and present danger test, but as you said, it was Brandeis who advocated counter speech and said you had to have a direct incitement that was likely to achieve violence. That wouldn't work now because the internet allows people to control rather than to have serendipity? Is that the difference?
Yeah, I think Brandeis, to bring him in contact with the internet is extremely interesting. So Brandeis's most distinctive contribution to our theory of freedom of expression was, I think, captured in the notion that the greatest menace is an inert people, And Holmes, with his less, let's say, romantic conception of politics, who agreed as a great fan of free speech, wouldn't say the greatest menace is an inert people. But that's Brandeis's view. Now, you could think of the social media from Brandeis's standpoint as kind of an extraordinary gift, that it's a lot easier to be I don't know that that's a word, but it's a lot easier to be active and engaged and to learn everything and to be involved than ever before. If you want to participate in some sense in a debate or give $1 or $20 to a candidate, you can do it immediately. You can learn stuff in a heartbeat. So from one standpoint, it's a great triumph for Brandeis's conception of citizenship. The idea which I was taught in law school is kind of the foundation of our system of free expression. The remedy is for falsehoods is more speech, not enforced silence. I think that's much more complicated than it was in Brandeis's time, or at least it's differently complicated, because there are a lot of falsehoods out there for which more speech is not an adequate remedy. And we're not talking now about, people believe that there are lots of people on Mars, and which is, I think, not true, but basically innocuous to think. It's that people are ending up thinking things that are actually dangerous. And so the challenge, and I think our foundation stone has to be Brandeis's theory, but it would not be consistent with his own deepest commitments to treat that foundation stone as a kind of rock that we can't touch, rather than a provisional hypothesis that every generation has to keep thinking about.
So Brandeisian solutions. For him, time was very important. He said as long as there's time enough for deliberation, he had faith in reason and triumphing. The internet has speeded up time, and you're also suggesting that because of self-segregation, people are less likely to deliberate. What do we do about that?
Well, I think if we have a case where the Colorado experiment is being replicated, not for the average American, but for many millions, the only solution to that is regulation-free, in the sense no censorship, just to try to create architectures, either through school or through things like this institution, or through good forms of political debate that some of our best leaders have tried to instantiate, where the demonization of the other is never, and the acknowledgement of the good faith and occasional correctness of the other is kind of modeled. Now this might be thought weak tea if you think the replication of the weak tea not meaning it's not delicious to drink, but like a pitiful remedy to plead for education and institutions and political modeling. But anything that's stronger would undo what is basically a legitimate part of the system of free expression, that is people's capacity to self-segregate. And there is a view that self-segregation can have macro benefits, in the sense that you get, in a well-functioning democracy, you get clumps of extremists who then come over to the larger public domain and can tell it something it really needs to know. So there's that. So that one, no remedy. The thing that seems to me a more difficult free speech issue is how to handle violent recruitment, where the clear and present danger test is not met, because even though the internet is speedy, the likelihood that ISIL's particular recruiting strategies are going to produce death imminently, that's not easy to show.
The test that you suggested, the expected value, is that the the learned hand, Dennis?
Yeah.
So to disaggregate, this was viewed in its time as an illiberal test because it seemed to allow the suppression of a great amount of speech. Do you really think Facebook should apply?
No. In terms of what to do exactly, I feel very tentative, and that I don't have a recipe here. But it is worth spelling out, I think, a little bit the issue. So when I was in Washington with the president's guidance in deciding whether to regulate pollution, we didn't think, does particulate matter, that's not a good pollutant, does it create a likely imminent risk of death? Now, you all have been exposed to particulate matter within the last 24 hours, and you all look really healthy, and there's no imminent risk of death that I can see or that I believe from particulate matter. So if you applied to regulation an imminent risk test, crazy, yes? It's a cost-benefit test. So what is the cost of, unless the law supersedes, the Clean Air Act raises some complexity for this, but bracket that. President Obama's general guidance is think about costs and think about benefits. That's the right test for regulation. Now, how to do it exactly is complicated, but imminent and likely, no. Costs and benefits. And that was the illiberal test that the Supreme Court endorsed in the context of the communist threat in the 50s, where it said if the risk of overthrow of the government or something really horrific is there, then it needn't be likely and imminent. Now that is not, I think, a self-evidently wrong position. It might in the end be wrong, but it's not obviously wrong. If the United States really faced a threat of, let's say, 10% risk that 1 million people are going to die in the middle of 2016, should we say more speech? It's not obvious. 10% risk, millions of people are going to die, middle of 2016. It's not likely, and it's not imminent. So I think, I guess, more than I did 5 years ago, that the old illiberal test, not that it's right, but that it has something in it that that deserves something other than the reaction we give to, palpably baseless, discarded law.
I have lots more questions, but I'm just going to ask one, and then we have 3 from the audience. And then Kaz has to teach his first class tomorrow in Cambridge, so we're going to get you out by 8. But my question is, are there other architectures of serendipity that might work? In your book, Republic.com, which was published a while ago, Jack Balkin said, it's all very well to suggest that you do that. There should be links to stories from the opposite point of view at the bottom of a news story, but people won't click on the link, they'll go watch The Simpsons or something instead. So now it's Facebook and Twitter, and we've moved on several architectures of social media. Are there any architectures of serendipity that work?
Yeah, some of the social media are actually thinking about this, and if I'm not mistaken, Google actually has something along these lines where they try to build in serendipity into your experience. And that can be engineered via algorithm. So Pandora is something where there's infinite capacity, both to say, okay, you like Taylor Swift, then you're going to hear a whole lot of Taylor Swift, and maybe just Taylor Swift. That's not the worst call, but maybe you should hear Steve Earle also. No, none of you know who Steve Earle is. Steve Earle is really good. He's really good. And you can build in serendipity, and you can actually ask for it, or you could be defaulted into serendipity, and then you could ask not for it. And one of the beautiful things about the social media and big data is that an architecture can be architected so that it really narrows your horizons to what you currently like, or it asks you to take a look at something else. And maybe you won't click on that thing, or maybe you'll click on it and think, oh my God, that's horrible. But once in a while, each of us will think, Steve Earle is good. This guy in the back who knows that, indisputable fact. Good is too weak. Or you might hear a political view from a candidate who you think you don't like and say, you know what, there's a point there.
Great. Questions from the audience. Does polarization significantly impact the Supreme Court?
Well, I mean, we do see across some dimensions disturbingly predictable voting. Now, whether that's because they're antecedently polarized or because of other factors, unclear. So we have a somewhat, not horrifically, but somewhat polarized Supreme Court. I would say that the contribution of social networks to that polarization is not zero, but is not huge. I doubt the justices are secretly under fake names on Twitter, following just like-minded others. That would be surprising.
I think actually this better be the last question, and that is, do facts ever matter? Have not great leaders moved opinion?
Okay, that's...
Do not facts ever matter? Have not great leaders ever moved opinion?
Yes, is the answer. I think what might be said about this is that if you look at social change, even social change that's resulted in constitutional change. So, should I have a little science experiment, science fiction experiment? Imagine, if you would, a world in which the Constitution is understood to permit racial segregation, or a world in which school prayer is completely authorized in public schools, or a world in which women can be barred from being lawyers, or a world in which states can have laws that say that people can be arrested for prowling by auto. All that seems kind of ridiculous, yes? It's not science fiction. That's the United States within, the lifetime of many people who are still on the planet. That's not science fiction. And the movement on each of those things did have something to do with leaders, no question. But as Jack Balkin has shown, and I think is increasingly clear, maybe every 5 years, the changes in the content of liberty and eventually changes in, let's say, the specification of our constitutional ideals, not in the ideal itself, but in how it's specified. It's much more bottom-up than leader-driven.
I always wish that our conversations could continue forever, but when you have to catch a plane, more speech is not better than less. Cass Sunstein, with your attention to empirical detail, your moderate spirit, you cast light on the most important social problems in the way that makes us look on our democracy in an entirely new light, and for that, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. You can say hi to Cass for 10 minutes, but then he's got to be out the door at 8, so his students will not be very cross with him. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks.